Hi everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian. How y'all doing? So, this particular case is one from 1891. And as far as I gathered, was never resolved. It seems like it was one of these cases popped up in the newspapers for, 3 or 4 days after it happened, and then it vanished. And I did a much deeper dive in trying to find information on this case than I did before. I found some new pieces of information, but nothing really super significant. But I looked up in newspaper databases, anywhere I could search. I looked up pretty much every name that was associated with this case, of which there wasn't really a whole lot. And some of which I don't even know their full names. And this is the 1891 murder of a guy named John Curtis, who it was originally thought that he may have committed suicide. And it's amazing how easily people get swayed. The initial implication posted in newspapers was that this guy probably took his own life. And so there started being all these unsubstantiated claims in newspapers that this guy was kind of erratic, or that this guy was kind of disheartened. He may have been suffering from depression. He was kind of unstable. And they were publishing all of this just unsubstantiated nonsense in these newspapers, trying to provide justification for why this guy would have killed himself. That was based on literally nothing. I found nothing to vindicate what was being said about this guy in that regard. Think about what the societal perspective was, even from medical professionals, psychologists, what the perspectives were about suicide at that time. So it was, most things back then, you just needed a quick, easy resolution to why bad things happened, and people just went with it. So a lot of times somebody committed suicide, it was always because they just went crazy out of nowhere, or they drank themselves into a stupor, to a state so mad and wild they forgot who they were, and then something happened and they died. But from a medical perspective, again, this was the general opinion. It wasn't even, upon investigation, it wasn't even firmly believed. It was this is probably a suicide, but he hadn't even had an autopsy done yet. He hadn't even had there was an actual coroner's jury put together for this case to try to actually figure out what they felt happened. And essentially, John Curtis is discovered in his little room upstairs at the Harrington Rooming House on what today would be today would be Martin Luther King Jr. and Ash Street, but would have been 4th and H Street. And that was the thing that confused me. I was discussing how I put the location of the house where he was killed in the wrong area, and here's why. So Burnside Street runs east and west. That is the dividing line between North Portland and South Portland. More specifically, northeast, northwest, and then southeast, southwest, and south. Before the streets got names, Burnside starts with a B. The next block south of there was Ankeny Street. So starting with Ankeny Street, back in the day, they were just lettered streets, and that was very common back in the old days. You just named streets. But starting with Ankeny and going north, it was A Street, B Street, C Street, and on and on. So you'll notice if you go up the streets, they're all names that are in alphabetical order. You've got Ankeny, Burnside, Cooch, Davis, Everett, Flanders, Gleason, so on and so forth. So H Street on the west side became Hoyt. So when I saw that, I knew John Curtis lived on the east side of the river, but I assumed, Hoyt Street runs on the east side of the river. So I instinctively thought that 4th and H Street would have been 4th and Hoyt on the east side. But here's what's interesting. The streets on the east side of the river were also letters for a long time. A Street, B Street, C Street, D Street. Now, I don't know how this worked. I don't know how this didn't make people lose their minds. But on the east side of the street, they go in reverse order. Instead of going north as you get further down the alphabet, you went south if you were on the east side of the river. I hope this is all making sense. So what I thought, I just presumed Northeast 4th and Hoyt would have been 4th and 8th Street on the east side of the river back in 1891. Actually, no. And I found a map from 1890, year before John Curtis is killed. And then there was another map from 1894 where all the streets had been given the names that they have today. So right around the time John Curtis was killed, or I guess right after, is when these streets got renamed. So anyway, so I found this 1890 map, and all of a sudden I noticed on the east side, because I wasn't even looking to verify the address. I was just trying to see if there was more information in these old maps that verified, what the area was like where I thought John Curtis was living. So I was checking the area of 4th and Hoyt, which is right next to the Oregon Convention Center now. And the Historic Murders of Portland episode I did there, thinking that was where it was. And I noticed a little bit further south that the letters started, and I started going like, well, wait a minute, A, B, C, D, it's going south instead of north, and I was like, oh my God, that's the dumbest, organization I've ever seen, but it answered the question of, it answered a question I didn't even know I needed to ask. So 4th and Hoyt, I realized, eventually 4th Avenue became Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. So 4th and 8th Street in 1891 on the east side is now Southeast MLK and Ash. Anyway, that's where the Harrington rooming house was. That's where John Curtis was living. And also, he worked at a place that was at, again, I thought it was like 3rd and L Street. So again, I thought, oh, okay, well, that would be what 3rd and Lovejoy would be today, which I think syncs up more with like Holiday Street or something like that. So then I had to refigure out where he worked. I had to figure out where 3rd and L Street on the east side of the river was. And I don't remember exactly where that was offhand, but I figured it out and wrote it down in my notes. So I had to completely reconfigure where everything was in this case. Those details given. Curtis is found in his rooming house. He's bent over a trunk. And he was discovered by a woman who was only reported in newspapers as Mrs. Voos, V-O-O-S. Her husband ran the rooming house, but she pretty much ran it with him. I think, though, in the 1890s, they didn't like to give men and women equal footing, even though they kind of both ran this house. And Mrs. Voos usually worked the front desk, and she would check rooms in the morning. She kind of, I guess, also did, turn down service, whatever. And it wasn't a hotel, it was just a rooming house, so they probably didn't want to outsource for a maid or someone to do that extra work when they could just get it done themselves. So she goes into his room, and I'm sorry, this is the dumbest thing in the world, but I'm not 100% certain about the date. For some reason, that's escaping me. I want to say it was April 12th. This is the morning of April 12th. That may be wrong. Fairly early morning, around 7 a.m., April 12th, 1891. Mrs. Voos goes up to, do the morning check of the rooms, and she notices John Curtis's doors cracked open. So, she doesn't really think anything suspicious about that, but she goes and she checks, she pops the door open, and she sees him down on his knees, leaned over this trunk. And she told reporters she initially thought that he was just up early, doing something, and she said something to the effect of, she asked him, hey, well, what's got you up so early in the day, working? And he doesn't respond. So that's a little strange, and she probably starts to realize he's not moving. She takes a step a little closer and realizes there's a little pool of blood on the floor next to the trunk, and it's dripping off the side of his cheek. And what had happened is he had been shot through the eye, and the blood was just draining out of that. Not to be graphic, but it was draining out of that hole down his cheek and then dripping to the floor. So Mrs. Voos, as you might do in that scenario, runs, flees the scene, tells her husband, authorities show up. There's a gun found in fairly close proximity. I never found a specific figure, but the implication is that it was found within 2 to 3 feet of John Curtis's body. And I think that was kind of the key figure that made people think it was a suicide. This guy gets shot through the head, and the gun is laying right next to him. Especially back then with much more primitive investigative methods, it's pretty easy to understand how they would come to that generalization that quickly. And it's funny, how quickly the media, the press, changed their perspective on things, because John Curtis is taken away. It's still kind of, not a certainty, but people are kind of the general opinion he killed himself. And he's analyzed by the coroners, given an autopsy. They actually convene a coroner's jury to try to settle the matter. And one of the doctors working on it just said that the circumstances of how the situation looked did not look like a suicide to him. He felt like the gun actually probably would have been further away from him, especially if Curtis shoots himself and he falls and his arm flops down and the gun falls out of his hand. It would hit the ground and bounce. There was little circumstantial things like that, but they also came to the conclusion, based on analyzing, the wound and whatnot, that Curtis had not been shot at point blank range, which would obviously be the case if you're shooting yourself with a handgun. They determined he was shot from probably about 5 to 6 feet away. And I don't know how long your arms are, but I don't think there's a whole lot of people in this world that have a 6-foot-plus long arm. And even if you did, why would you shoot yourself from that far away? So it immediately, drop of a hat, became a murder case. And I agree with that. Some people might say, well, is that all? But and of course, as I talk about more details in this case, you might see why I never really felt like this was a suicide. But the moment that they came, and there was even a little bit of blowback from newspapers, especially the ones that were like, oh, it was a suicide, no doubt about it. They made a point of saying that the coroners were being overly, maybe gregarious is the right word, or that they were being overly optimistic about their conclusions. Mind you, these are newspaper people, don't know shit about autopsies and stuff like that, and they're calling out the work of these coroners. But even the coroner's jury decided in the end this was not a suicide, this was a murder. And there's some real interesting circumstances around that. But eventually, pretty much all newspapers suddenly turned around and were like, hey, John Curtis seemed to be a happy-go-lucky, fairly well-adjusted, pretty content fellow. Nobody who knew him said, anything strange about him. Nothing to them suggested anything was going on in his life that might lead him to killing himself. And obviously, plenty of people have killed themselves without showing signs that they were going to do that. But back in the 1890s, especially a guy like John Curtis, this was a guy that he'd worked in stables. He was like a bartender. This guy, he had friends. He liked to be around people. There was just no, back then, let's just say it was different then than it is now in terms of how people are. What's so interesting is there's evidence to suggest somebody had gone up to his room and probably killed him. But what's really interesting is multiple people heard of what they described as a loud fall somewhere in that apartment house. The presumption being that was John Curtis's body falling, landing partially on the trunk, but his knees were on the ground. That was probably the cause for that sound. Multiple people heard that. And, it's just, it's like a 2-story rooming house. This isn't the Portland Hotel. It's a fairly small building, so it makes sense that anybody staying there would hear that. Not one person in that rooming house heard a gunshot. And you could have been outside a block away, and you probably would have heard that gun go off. But nobody, the Voos didn't hear anything. Nobody anywhere in the rooming house reported hearing gunshots. They reported hearing the loud fall, but not the gunshots. Which is, it's so strange because there's not really any evidence to suggest that John Curtis was killed somewhere else, thus shot, nobody in the building hears it, and then relocated to his rooming house, which would be extremely risky. Why would you take the risk of dragging a guy who's got a gunshot wound in the head back into his rooming house where someone might see you, and he's dead. You've got to drag his slumping body up the stairs, and he would have been bleeding out. I mean, unless they wrapped a rag around his head or something, but if they did that, it would have smeared blood around his face, and there was no indication that that had happened. So it's illogical to think that he was killed elsewhere, and of all the places to take him, you take him back to his rooming house, drag him upstairs into his room. That would be an incredibly stupid thing to do, and there's no physical evidence to suggest that happened. No blood on the floor outside of his room, no evidence that his, wound had been covered or bandaged by someone who brought him in. But it's just bewildering to me that nobody heard a gunshot. So it's like there's evidence that he was shot there, but there's evidence that he wasn't. But one of the two had to happen. Either he was shot in his room or he wasn't. Because there is reason to believe that he may have been killed in his room shortly after midnight. Now, if you dismiss the fact that nobody heard a gunshot, and there was, I know some people will put a pillow over someone's face and then bury the gun into the pillow and shoot, and it kind of muffles the shot. But there was no bloody pillow with a hole in it found in the room. There was no feathers from the pillow that flew out. There was just nothing. Everything about the crime suggested he was shot in his room, except that nobody heard a gunshot. There was a guy which I'll get back to, there was a guy in the room right next to him. Their room was connected by a door. Not only was it connected by a door, but it had a glass frame in it. You could literally see from one room into the other. It's a pretty stupid place to kill someone, honestly. Because, whoever did it managed to escape, but the odds are kind of long. You have to think you shoot somebody. He had an upstairs room. You shoot somebody. Now you have to escape. Well, you shoot someone. You go out in the hall. People are probably going to be coming out of their rooms, you would have thought. And then you got to run down the stairs past whoever might be seeing you down there and then run out of the building. It's an extremely brazen situation. But here's one thing. And unfortunately, nobody thought of it enough, which I guess I can understand under the circumstances. If you're not aware a murder's just happened, you're not going to respond to something like this, but it would have been nice if somebody did. I think it was Mr. Voos specifically told authorities and reporters, he heard this loud, what other people heard in the building that sounded like a hard fall. And he said shortly after that, he heard somebody running down the stairs. Didn't see them, just heard them. So odds are, he gets shot, he hits the ground. A brief moment later, whoever's responsible is running down the stairs and fleeing the building. Now, considering the fact that it was sometime after midnight, it, by that point, they're probably not, even though it's, the more rough and tumble 1890s of Portland, they're probably not checking a lot of people in the middle of the night at this place. So, and the Voos have to sleep at some point. So it seems to me that I didn't read this wasn't in the information, but it seems like they had probably closed up shop and had gone to bed or were in their quarters when they heard this stuff. So nobody was out at the front desk or near the front door going into the building to actually see whoever ran down the stairs. Hence, they were never seen. Presuming whoever was running down the stairs was responsible for the murder, which, yeah, probably. This is what we're stuck with. It seems like, somebody, and the thing is Curtis, I don't think Curtis was actually seen returning home. But based on information I'll get into, the night before he was found dead, he was out with people. And it seemed like based on those circumstances, the earliest he would have made it home would have been probably shortly before midnight, if not after. So I feel like whoever killed him was probably shortly after midnight. So it's unknown if when he came home somebody was in his company who went up to his room amicably, seemingly with him, and then shot him in the room for whatever reason. Or somebody showed up there later. And being the 1890s, even if the Voos had gone off to bed or whatever, it's the 1890s. I don't think they were locking their front door. So whoever wanted to come in and out could have. And as far as I could gather, as far as I could see in any of the information available, again, John Curtis was pretty easygoing, chill guy. He wasn't rich by any means. He didn't have any enemies. There would be no incentive for someone to specifically go up to his room and, like, rob him. He was a bartender living out of a small rooming house. Like, this was not a prime target for really any sort of crime, except for possibly one, which would be the crime of stealing one's heart, so to speak. And this is the overarching aspect of the story that I absolutely, this is what keeps the story with me, is the love triangle. So after John Curtis is found dead, obviously they try to figure out, about it, especially once they determined it was a murder. They got to figure out who knew him. Did he have any enemies? Did he know any people that would have incentive to kill him? So on and so forth. And they very quickly discover that there's not one but two women who claim that they were going to marry John Curtis. It was in the works. It was moving forward. It was planned. There was a woman named Jenny Gibbs who had known... it's really interesting because Jenny Gibbs and the other woman I'm going to mention both claim to have known John Curtis for exactly 7 years. Jenny Gibbs, as she put it, met John while he was working more like stable work with horses and stuff like that, which, I mean, that used to be a big business back then, because people were traveling by horse-drawn carriages. Again, John Curtis had worked in this business for many years before he began transferring over to doing more like restaurant bartending type work. I don't know what pushed him in that direction. Maybe he was just ready for a life change, but that's what he was doing. But while he was doing more stable work, he periodically was in business with Jenny's family. So they kind of met each other and knew each other. Were always amicable, but never really had much of a romance up until recent months when they had become, again, as Jenny put it, more romantically involved. And she said he wanted to marry her. And she said that she resisted, even though she wanted to. And the main reason she resisted him was because he'd been fooling around with another woman. Now, I don't know if he was having a full-on affair from one with the other. Again, both women claim that he was going to marry them. So either one is in a position to argue that he was maybe having an affair with the other woman. But what's interesting is neither woman really put it that way. It didn't seem that Jenny was really that bothered. So Jenny says that she kind of resisted his offer of marriage because he was mixed up with this other woman. And she said that his experience with this other woman was it was always chaotic. They were always arguing. She was always treating him like crap. And she just kind of used him for his attention and affection and probably money, honestly, even though, again, he didn't really have a lot of money. And this is what Jenny and John Curtis discussed, again, according to her, the last night she saw him, which was, it would have been, I believe, April 10th. It was the night before his last full day of life. And he had visited her. She lived just on the west side of the river. And he made this promise to her. And it didn't even seem like he was doing it just to appease her, to get her to say yes to his wedding proposal. But it seemed to her like he'd been mixed up with this other woman for a while, and he was kind of fed up with it, and he knew she was stringing him along and kind of using him, and he said he was going to, finally break it off with this woman. And Jenny said, like, okay, fine. If you do that and you show me proof that you're going to do that and that you're going to be just with me, we can get married in a month. So that was the implication, was they were going to get married in a month if John held to his guns. So this is what would have been 4th and 8th Street many, many moons ago. This is the intersection that John Curtis lived at. And it's just interesting that today at this intersection, there's this old, it's really tagged up. It's been vacant, I think, for a really long time. But this is an old Salvation Army building. You can see it's just been all tagged up in an assortment of different ways. It's been deemed unsafe for firefighters, but if you look up here, right up there with that circle, that's where you can even still see the outline of that Salvation Army logo, the kind of badge-shaped thing that they have. So there's a Salvation Army building here right at the intersection where John Curtis once lived more than a century ago. But what's further, I mean, this is really just kind of an interesting coincidence. It really doesn't have anything to do with the story, but Jenny Gibbs, or Jenny Pillpot, which I guess was her maiden name that she may have gone away from or gone back to, I'm not really sure, but she lived at 2nd and Ash. Or I guess it would have been, would it have still, yeah, no, it would have been Ash, on west side of the river, downtown area. 1 block down from where she lived, there's still another old building standing that is also a Salvation Army building. Again, it doesn't add anything to the story. It's just kind of an interesting coincidence that this one guy and the woman he was reportedly going to marry both lived like right where 2 specifically Salvation Army type buildings ended up. I don't know. It was something I noticed, so I thought I'd add it to the video. Oh my God, what happened to my background? So this is important because now, you know, he's mixed up in this romantic thing between these 2 women, and he's apparently told one that he's going to break things off with the other. That alone has been enough to lead some to kill in the past. And that brings in a woman whose first name I have still yet to find, because she's only referenced in newspapers as Mrs. Ben West, because she was married to a guy who wasn't even named Ben West or Benjamin West. Benjamin was his middle name. I actually found that out through doing some more information. And the newspapers described him as a merchant, an Portland East Side merchant. And I found this one guy who, again, Benjamin was his middle name and West was his last name. And in his obituary, it referenced how he used to be an East Side Portland merchant. So I'm like, oh, well, they have to be the same guy. And that's how she was described. So this was Mrs. Ben West, and she was actually divorced from this guy who I'm going to just keep calling him Ben West just because I can't remember his actual first name. And it seems like Ben West was the name he went by. So she's divorced from this guy. She's not cheating on him, but she also has said that she's been hooked up with John Curtis for a while. And it's a budding romance. Mrs. West had 2 children that both of them had medical issues. One of them was blind. She was constantly having medical bills she had to pay, which pretty much the only way she could pay her kids' medical bills was she would grovel back to Ben West and beg for money to pay for them. And she said that, you know, John Curtis loved, you know, her kids loved John Curtis. They loved him even more than their actual father, who was just a deadbeat who pretty much gave birth to them and then ran away. So, yeah, so she also says, like, yeah, John Curtis and I, we're going to get married soon. And Mrs. West's story is that they needed to try to save up money. They planned on getting married and then realized they needed to postpone it because they just didn't have enough money. And Mrs. West claimed that she was getting some money on the side that she could save, and John was going to try to save his money, and eventually they were going to have enough money saved up that they could actually get married. Now, unlike Jenny Gibbs, who there's not really any reason to necessarily believe her or disbelieve her on the face of it that they were going to get married, there's kind of some issues with Mrs. West's story. Maybe she was just bad with money, or maybe she really didn't care about the marriage at all. She was just trying to keep John Curtis around, because even if John Curtis only had $1 left in his pocket, Mrs. West would take it. She would be like, I need money. She would constantly bleed him dry, and yet here's a woman that says they're trying to save up money so they can get married, and she always had an excuse for why she couldn't save up money. Some of that was her kids' medical bills, which is a valid reason, but then she would, you know, every time John had a little bit of money on him, she would take it. She would bet, you know, one time Mrs. Voos claimed to have overheard Mrs. West saying she needed money, and he was like, I've only got $5 to my name, which, I mean, was a decent amount of money back then, but still not that much. And she pretty much whined and said, well, it's my birthday, so I know you have to give it to me. So Mrs. West it seems like, was kind of a drama queen, kind of a user. There's a lot less reason to not believe that she was truly genuine in wanting this marriage than, say, with Jenny Gibbs. But Mrs. West got a little bit more attention, which makes sense because her story was a little bit more dramatic. Because the primary reason, according to her, and I didn't see anything to counter this, she claimed the main reason her and Ben West got divorced was because of his treatment of her children, which makes me hate this. It seems like this Ben West guy was just he was maybe successful. He was a merchant, and it seems like he really liked being with his wife, but he couldn't stand her children. And it doesn't seem like her children were, overtly ruckus, crazy, tearing his home apart or anything. It seemed like pretty much just he didn't like the fact they were an inconvenience to him. Which if these kids had lots of medical issues and stuff like that, that is such a shitty thing. And apparently he wanted to force her to put them into an orphanage so that they could just, be rid of them. And she refused to do that. And that, according to her, is the reason their marriage fell apart. And what's really interesting, I find this very interesting, and I don't really know if this is overtly damaging to Mrs. West's case or otherwise, but through all of this, she was still living at Ben West's home, which was called, I think, the Philadelphia Rooming House. I think it was on the west side of the river, kind of near the waterfront, I want to say. It was probably a pretty nice place if it was Ben West's place. But yeah, through all this time, her connecting and, supposedly falling in love with John Curtis and planning to marry him and all this stuff, she was still living with her ex-husband. And I think, again, according to her, a lot of that was out of just necessity. She just didn't have a lot of money. She was spending all the money on her kids. She probably didn't have cash to, find a place of her own, much less to find a place that she'd have to pay for and then have to pay out to support her kids. She was probably in a fairly tight spot, so it seems like this is out of necessity. But what's so interesting is, apparently for like a pretty lengthy period of time, Ben West and John Curtis are an item, according to her. And Ben West never met him. Ben West said that he'd like seen him, I think, once in passing, like he could recognize him if he saw him on the street, but they never spoke. They never got together. There was no correlation between them. And which I find interesting was she couldn't have hid that from John. John would have had to have known. But was she hiding her thing with John from Ben? That's very possible, because Ben West expressed that he had no idea that she was like that serious with this guy, that they were planning on getting married or any of that. And maybe that whole marriage claim by Mrs. West is nonsense, but at the same time, it could be she also kept that off the table and hid it from Ben West, wondering that, if she finally admitted to him, because it seems like the reason they broke, again, if the reason they separated, got divorced, was because she refused to give in to what he wanted, there's an implication that there may still be like some romantic love there, independent of the children issue. That could maybe be why Ben West let her stay at his place. He maybe still had feelings for her, and she may have taken advantage of that, seemingly the same way that she took advantage of John Curtis by taking his every last penny whenever it was available to her. And if she told Ben West, hey, I'm in love with somebody else and I'm going to go marry this guy, she may have been worried that Ben West would have kicked her out. And it seems like even though they were, she was so in love with John Curtis and they were going to get married and her kids loved him and everything was so great. I know it's the 1890s and there's certain things that, were taboo back then, such as living together before you get married. But why wouldn't, if she did get kicked out, why wouldn't she just go live with, I know John Curtis is just living in this tiny rooming house, but wouldn't they have figured something out? I think she was concealing that from Ben West solely because she was concerned about getting kicked out on the street. And again, I question a lot of her story, so much of the romance. Was it really that serious? Because of the way she seemingly treated John, it seemed like he was just mostly an ATM machine for her. There's just a lot of little things that make me wonder if this was real for her, or whether she was just blowing this out of proportion. And of course, if Mrs. Ben West is responsible for his murder, which is, I think, the strongest theory in this case, it would only behoove her to come out after he's found dead and say, oh, no, we were so in love, we were going to get married, it was so great. And, she had as much criticism, if not more, to say about Jenny Gibbs as Jenny Gibbs had to say about her. Again, Jenny Gibbs said that, whenever Mrs. West was around, her and John Curtis were always just arguing. They never got along well. Well, Mrs. West stated, maybe John had a love for Jenny at some point, but it was gone now. It had faded away, and she was really just a nuisance that kept hanging around, and John really didn't want her around, but just kind of let her be around. And Mrs. West even said, like, oh, well, I was nice to her. I tried to be nice to her for the sake of, her and John's dynamic, which she would probably want to narrow down from romance to, like, just a friendship. But beyond the fact that I question her motives, I question elements of her story, there's certain things about John Curtis's, the last people that saw him. There's some instances that are really provide the foundation for why I think Mrs. West is the strongest. As far as we know, it's unlikely, but it could have been a random person that we don't know. It could have been some kind of robbery gone wrong. I guess, a lot of hotels used to get robbed back during this time. So rooming houses are only one step down from a hotel. So I don't know. Maybe it was more common back then for people to break into people's rooms at rooming houses and try to rob them blind. They had revolving doors. You could go in and out and take people's stuff. That was very common, at least in Portland, for people to go into people's hotel rooms. Just sneak in there, take whatever you could get real quick and run away. But yeah, in terms of Mrs. West, I feel in my heart of hearts she was really just using John because he was nice to her, and whenever she needed money, he gave in and gave it to her again, even if it was his last dime. But there was one particular instance that Mrs. Voos told reporters about the day after John's found dead. She said that one night John came home. She was there at the front, and John comes in. Jenny Gibbs and Mrs. Ben West are both with him. All three of them are hanging out. It's kind of weird, and they're all drunk as hell. So Mrs. Voos doesn't want this nonsense, so she kind of chastises them for showing up drunk, making a big ruckus, and being all loud. I run a decent home here, you youngins. And according to her, after she, kind of gave these guys a stern talking to, Mrs. Ben West pulls a gun and points it at her and essentially tells her to shut up, I'll blow your brains out. She didn't, but Mrs. Voos stated that this event happened, which says one of two things. It shows, okay, Mrs. West is a little drunk. Okay, fine, there's that edge to it. But it certainly shows that she, on the one hand, didn't really seem to have much of an issue threatening someone's life. It also showed that she had open access to a gun. Was that firearm she pulled on Mrs. Voos the same one laying on the floor in John Curtis's room when he's found dead? We don't know. This is Portland, 1890s. Practically anybody with a heartbeat and a brain could go out and get a gun. 1891, people weren't really tracing guns, even if the gun, fingerprint evidence isn't even really much of a thing. So even if it was a gun that, Mrs. Ben West had bought, and even if it did have her fingerprints on it, there's nothing in the articles that even suggests they checked for fingerprints, because, again, I don't even really think that was a thing yet. She could have bought that gun from a random person, or maybe even stole it, gone in, shot him, dropped the gun there to make it look like a suicide, or even if she, shot him and then was like, oh my God, what have I done, and just dropped the gun in a panic and ran. You could still get away with that long ago without people necessarily knowing it was you. But this does show, not long before John Curtis was murdered, that Mrs. Ben West had a gun, and she apparently was okay carrying it around and pulling it out on someone. Now, again, a lot of people were carrying guns during that time back in Portland, but at the same time, a lot of them were usually men. So there's that little episode that's fairly revealing. But then you go to John Curtis's final night. Again, I think he was killed probably shortly after midnight, April 12th, again, is what I believe it was. So his last night would be the evening of April 11th. Multiple people saw him. He went to the place, it was called the Delta. It went under a couple. There was the Delta Saloon, the Delta Tasting House. It was the bar that he worked at. He went there that night. Some of his friends and coworkers saw him. Some papers reported that there was nothing strange about him. Other things reported that friends of his thought that John appeared distracted. So I wonder, well, was he distracted because he was about to tell Ben West that it was over? Mrs. Ben West that it was over? And he was worried about how she'd react? That's been a lingering thing, or I say a lingering thing like numerous researchers have poured over this case, but let's see, for me, that was a lingering thing, was if he does tell Jenny Gibbs, who I find to be a much more reliable resource for information than Mrs. West, if he tells her, okay, I'm going to break it off with her, because he told her tomorrow I'm going to tell her. Of course, she might not and probably would not take that very well. When some of his friends say that they saw him and he looked distracted, was he, mulling it over and thinking this thing through and being like, oh, this is not going to go great? Most of what I've seen about Mrs. West kind of implies, at least as far as I can tell, that she was maybe a little bit unstable. That's very much the vibes. I mean, not just because she pulled a freaking gun on John Curtis's landlord, essentially. Just a lot about her demeanor gives me the idea that she was a little bit unstable. Now, being a little bit unstable doesn't necessarily make you psychotic. It doesn't necessarily make you a killer. But what I'm getting at is I get the very strong vibes that if he did try to break it off with her that night, she probably would have reacted in a very, very erratic way, which I think was in part her personality, how she was. But if she was serious about this relationship, now she's just left on her own again with her 2 sickly kids, relying on handouts from her ex-husband, who's a friggin' douchebag that doesn't even like her kids. Where does she go from there? I also get the vibe, especially since he would just give this woman whatever money she wanted, I kind of get the feeling that John Curtis was a little bit of a pushover. And I get the feeling Mrs. Ben West probably felt like she definitely wore, and she probably did, wore the pants in that relationship, and felt like she could pretty much manipulate this guy into whatever she wanted, so it probably would have really thrown her asunder if all of a sudden the guy breaks it off with her. It's like, oh man, this guy's actually got some balls. Okay, I didn't see that coming. But Mrs. West's story, especially, it's so ridiculous. Her story about when they bumped into each other, which literally it was like they just bumped into each other by chance. Like maybe they were planning on seeing each other that night before he was found dead, or not, but the implication is almost that it was like destiny randomly brought them together in this one part of this city. She claims that she was just out and about and she suddenly stumbles onto John, who's hanging out with some friends, and she needed to go across the bridge to the west side, present-day downtown, to go talk to a friend. She had to do something involving a friend. She needed to go contact them and do something. And she says, and John was like, okay, well, I'll be waiting here for you when you come back across the bridge. So the implication was she's going to go handle that, come back, and they'll meet up and hang out. So she then begins to cross the bridge to go across the Willamette River under the west side, when all of a sudden she feels a pair of hands wrap around her, and there's John. And it's like he was going to wait for her, but he couldn't stand to be away from her for a moment, and he threw his arms around her and almost picked her up off the ground, like, I will escort you to the other. It's this princess, it's such a ridiculous story. I can't believe it actually happened this way. And I've noticed, especially in the old days, that was a very common thing for especially somebody who was guilty of killing someone, especially somebody who killed someone but didn't really want to take the responsibility for it. Like, they rejected me, so I had to kill him. There's another case that's kind of stayed with me, which was the murder of a woman named Tessie Lotiso, if I'm even pronouncing that right. I think it was the start of the 1920s. It may have even been the end. I want to say it was 1920 when this happened. I haven't looked at it in a while, but she married this guy named Thomas Lotiso. She was a war bride. He met her while he was serving in World War II when she was British, and he brought her back. And they got married, and, like a lot of marriages at that time, it wasn't great, and she ended up finally breaking up with him. I don't know if they ever officially got divorced, but she left him and moved in with a bunch of her female friends that Thomas became convinced were just continuously just sullying his name against her. And he felt that, as long as, she's living with these women that are, we're actually probably helping her move ahead in life, but they're poisoning her against him. he's going to continue to lose momentum. And I mean, honestly, by this point, he wasn't getting her back. It's the typical thing. It's that very, it's still prevalent in men today, but it was even more so back then. This attitude that, the man is number one. He's the king. He's the ruler. I'm a man. You're a woman. You don't get to leave me. Obviously society frowned on separations and divorce and infidelity and all that stuff. So, if you were a woman and left, people had a lot of things to say about you. But fortunately, Tessie had this kind of support group of friends that supported him. They were like, no, get away from this guy. He's bad news. And things keep getting worse and worse. And he's starting to threaten her friends. Thomas is getting very unhinged. And who knows if he had, maybe some PTSD from the war. I don't know. He may have just been a piece of shit. He may have just, I don't know. And one day, Tessie is having a meal with her friends in the Chinatown area. He shows up, grabs her, and drags her out of the restaurant, throws her into a cab, and has her drive out west, kind of the vicinity of Alder and 15th, which is where Alder and 15th I don't even think exists anymore. It's whatever intersection would happen where Alder Street crosses I-405 on the backside of downtown. And apparently the cab stops, and Tessie, the moment it stops, she jumps out of the cab and tries to run for it. And Thomas has reached his limit. She's still trying to get away from him. She doesn't want him. He stepped out of the cab and shot her dead in cold blood as she tried to run away. And the reason I'm bringing up this story is because in the aftermath of killing his wife and going on trial, Thomas Lotiso gave another one of these just ridiculous stories that makes it look like he had such a wonderful romance and that it really wasn't that bad. When the reality of it was this was a woman who wanted to get away and a guy that wouldn't let her. And just a very disturbing example of what happens during that time when you're a man who not only feels emasculated by the fact that your wife left you, but now he feels emasculated by the fact that she has all these women friends that are constantly just berating you and making you look worse. And just the effects of what, a very toxic masculine psyche can lead you to. But Thomas Lotiso gave this story that they stop and Tessie gets out and tries to run away crying, and she trips and falls over, and he runs up to her, and when she tried to run, her hat fell off because, every woman on the street wore hats back then. And he runs up and he embraces her, and he gives her her hat back, and he kisses her and says, honey, let's just forget everything that's happened and let's just go home. And she apparently is okay to do this. It's the stupidest, most nonsensical story. It's a story of a raving maniac. And then he claims that, because again, another thing is, like most men, when a woman leaves you, the immediate presumption is that they're leaving you for another man. It couldn't just possibly be that you're a shitty mate and they need to get away from you to save their sanity. It's always there must be another man, because you couldn't possibly want to leave me. It's just you're in love with the next guy that came along. It was such an absurd story. That I feel is even more so, but I link this story that Mrs. West tells very closely with that story. This whole he was like, oh yeah, I'll see you when you come back across the bridge. But then it was like, no, I can't stand to be away from you a moment, my love. And so John Curtis, accompanies Mrs. West across the river. And because she just uses this guy so ceaselessly, when they got to the place that she was trying to go to, it was a second floor apartment. She literally was like, I was so tired once we got there that I begged him to go up the stairs to do this thing for me. I'm like, really? I know it's an old stereotype that women would just fall faint at a given moment, but really? You play, you didn't even know this guy was going to be with you before, and now you get to your friend's house and you're like, no, that's 10 steps. I couldn't possibly climb those. So he goes up and knocks on the door. Nobody's home. So they leave. They come back a little later, and she has him go back up again. I don't know why she was trying to. There was never an explanation for why she went to this one particular friend's house. why she needed to do that. Maybe she knew she was going to kill John that night and was trying to formulate some kind of an alibi. That seems like a stretch. I don't know. So they return, and this time when he goes up to knock on the door, there's a note on the door that says, like, we'll be back later. And finally they just decide, screw it. They walk back across the river to the east side, and this is when they go to the Delta Tap House, or whatever the hell it was called. And they're there for a little while, and again, this is where a couple of John's friends say he looks distracted. Mrs. West says she's hungry. They get up, they go to a place called Jerry's Restaurant. They have a meal. They're there for about a half hour. One of the workers there says they saw them while they were there. Nothing seemed awry. They seemed to be getting along just fine. And then they left. So once they left this restaurant, which I want to say was like around 11 p.m., maybe a little after 11 p.m., that's the last time anybody saw them together. That's the last time anybody besides Mrs. West saw John Curtis alive, was the people at this restaurant. And according to Mrs. West, she needs to go home. It's weird because in the same article, she says that she was going to go to a friend's house to stay the night. Maybe that was the friend she was going to visit. That doesn't really make sense to me, though. But yeah, she initially says that she was going to go stay at a friend's house. But then in this same interview that's posted in the local newspaper, she says that she went back to Ben West's place where she was living. So it made sense that she would go there. And all of a sudden, this claim that she was going to go stay at a friend's house just disappears. It never happened. She never made the statement when she did. And so, yeah, she claims they leave the restaurant. They, walk a little ways. I think he offered to walk her across the bridge again to walk her home. She says, no, that's fine. And they parted ways. She went home to Ben West's place, and John presumably walked the couple of blocks to his rooming house. And the area where they separated would have been just that. It would have only been a couple blocks from where he lived. So I wish I could get a real solid figure as to when they left that restaurant, in which they would have parted ways not only probably minutes later, and when John was known to have come home, because the people at the restaurant said it was around 11 p.m. when they left. The implication is it was probably around midnight before John gets home. So if John's only a couple blocks from his place, why does it take him almost an hour to get back to his rooming house? And nobody else saw him, so there's no verification. Maybe he stopped off at maybe he went back to the Delta place to have a drink. Maybe he went to this place for a drink. Maybe he just walked the streets thinking about life. And there's no indication as far as we know that he did officially break it off with her. But again, that could have happened after they left the restaurant. It just seems strange to me that why it took him, at least there's a black hole there. There's no explanation for why it took him so long to get home. And then he's killed shortly after he arrives. One possible theory is probably when they leave the restaurant and they're about to part for the evening, maybe that's when he finally decides to tell her. Maybe, I don't know. He decides to tell her, hey, listen, I'm going to be marrying Jenny. This isn't going to work. We can't do this anymore. And Mrs. West has whatever reaction she has. Again, I think she probably have a fairly aggressive, confrontational, emotional reaction to that. Nobody was around to see this reaction if it did happen. Could he have invited her back to his place, which would go in contravention to the story she gave, and he decides to talk to her there? Maybe he would feel safer on his own home turf. But if she was reactive then, wouldn't people have heard her, you'd think if she got reactive and lost it and then shot him in the height of passion, you would have heard the gunshot, for one, but you would have heard her probably start yelling before then, reacting to it. What do you mean you can't leave me? We were going to get married, you fool. So I don't know, but I think it's very possible that maybe he had her go back to his place with her to try to give her the news. And again, she's, at least in one instance, known to carry a gun on her. Or maybe he tells her on the way so that right before they get there, the cat's out of the bag, and then she, wants to go in with him and try to convince him to stay, and he won't do it. She shoots him and runs away. There's many possibilities, but, they're plausible. They're absolutely plausible that Mrs. West could have done this. She would have had the time. Again, when you think about the fact that they presumably parted ways at least an hour before he's shot dead, she would have had ample time to stay with him, claim they parted ways and that she just went back to Ben West's place, claim that that's what happened when in reality she killed him. Again, when they separated, they were only blocks away from his place. And she wouldn't have had to walk that far after, leaving his place, crossing the bridge, getting to the Philadelphia house where she was living with West. That wouldn't have taken that long. And here's the tweak, and unfortunately, this is one detail that I can't remember exactly what it was, but a key element to this case is that Mrs. West doesn't quite have an alibi for her actions, because when she returned to Ben West's place, he wasn't home yet. He had gone to a saloon to have some drinks, and the one figure I can't remember for certain if it was given was when he said he went home. Because the implication was he was out late drinking, so was he out even past midnight? It provides us a window of knowing generally how much time there was between when John Curtis and Mrs. West are last seen together leaving the restaurant, again, presumably around 11 p.m., and when Ben West gets home, which if that was maybe, even if it was 1 a.m., that's 2 hours. So Mrs. Ben West, claims she went straight home to his place, but there's no verification for when she actually showed up until Ben West gets there. And the implication was that, she hadn't been there for a super long time, but she'd been there for a little while. 15, 20 minutes before he comes home. But when Ben West is spoken to, he says that when he shows up, she's standing by the front door, and when he walks in, she's taking her coat off like she's just got there and is hanging her coat up, which implies she got there a minute before him. So did she not get to that house quite as early as she said she did? Thus giving her more time to have possibly shot. And again, I thought she would need a lot of extra time when I did my first video, because I thought, again, that 4th and H Street was 4th and Hoyt, when really it's 4th and Ash. Well, 4th and Ash is much closer. It's a beeline across the bridge into downtown Portland, and then to get to Ben West's rooming house, which was not that far back from the waterfront. You could get walking, at a casual, leisurely walking place. You could easily get from the site where John Curtis's rooming house was to the vicinity of where Ben West lived in 15 minutes if you were dragging your feet. And again, there's barely any traffic back then. You don't have a whole bunch of stoplights and walk signals to wait for. There's there's not even cars around yet. It's just horses and carriages. She could have gotten home very quickly after killing him. So did Mrs. West take out this young man, possibly for rejecting her? You don't reject me. We were gonna get married, you fool. Gets very dramatic, and for some people, we're all different. Some people, it doesn't even take a lot of emotion to get the best of you, to get you thinking violent, to get you acting violent. I think that's a very strong possibility if the information that has been bore out, if what Jenny Gibbs says about how he was going to break it off with this woman, if what Mrs. Vu said about how Mrs. West was seemed to be stringing along John Curtis and just using him for his money, and apparently didn't have a problem pulling guns on people and threatening their lives. And if you look at the time, I think she would have probably had enough time to kill John Curtis, get back across the river, and it seems like there was never any real suspicion on either of these women. That's what's interesting. I think the real drama was the fact that this was kind of a love triangle. Who's telling the truth? Who was he really going to marry? Did he promise both of them? What a cad. And yeah, I just think there's potential motive, and time-wise, I think she probably would have had enough time to do it. And I think she's the strongest suspect, but I would never say beyond a reasonable doubt she did it, because this is all very circumstantial. I don't really have any suspicion about Jenny Gibbs. However, if this was to take kind of a Hollywood twist, where there's the one character that you think is the worst of the two in a love triangle scenario, and you keep thinking, like, they're the bad guy, and then in the end you find out that the other one was really the bad. It's kind of like a Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, where you think what you think the circumstances are at the start of the movie actually ends up being the opposite. Something kind of along those lines. But I don't really think, and especially since when it came to expressing their love of John, she wasn't as, like, gregarious and over-exaggerating in terms of what that love was. She was like, yeah, we were romantic, and he asked me to marry him, and I said, break it off with that other guy, and we'll do it. If she killed him off, again, I feel like there would be extra incentive there to be like, no, I'm the one that really loved him. We were the ones that were really in love. We were the ones that were actually going to get married, because that potentially makes you look more innocent. If you love someone that much, why would you kill them? So the fact that she didn't go to those extremes the way Mrs. West did is another extra little thing that just really, I've never really been suspicious that she did it. And also, there's no evidence John Curtis was with her that night. There's no evidence she was in the vicinity of his... she lived on the other side of the river. No evidence she was even in the vicinity of where he was that night. And, she didn't pull a gun on the woman who runs the rooming house where this guy's later found dead. But before throwing most of my eggs in a basket on the Mrs. West did it theory, there is another possible angle. Now, a little earlier, I referenced that there was another room connected to John Curtis's room. And that room was connected by a door. And they were both just, little rooms. One was John Curtis's room. You go through the door to the next room. It's another room for someone to stay. I don't know if that door was locked. I mean, nowadays you think, of course, it would be locked. I don't want some random stranger in the next room coming into my room. But how would you even do that now that I think about it? Because both sides of both rooms would have an incentive to maybe have a lock on their door. So would there be a lock on both sides? And if there's a lock on both sides, if that was even possible, that means each person would have the ability to unlock the door as well. So I don't say you could lock it, but there was also a window. They said that the door had windows in it, which means whoever was in the room right next to John Curtis's room, even if they had been asleep by the time he comes home and gets shot, if he was shot and there was, he falls and hits the ground, whoever was in that next room would have been able to open their eyes and look through that window and see at least the end of what was going on and react. And there was a man staying in that room. The Vooz never got his name. He was just described as a transient, seemingly passing through, which those were a dime a dozen in Portland during that time. So it very well could have just been a guy who needed a place for the night to sleep it off and then move on. That's what a lot of people did. Especially when you found work, you'd go work somewhere and try to get a hotel or a rooming house room near where that was. You get that work done. You move over to this side of town. You move to a motel or hotel or a rooming house closer to there. So it's very possible that whoever was in the room next to John Curtis was just, staying the night and going to leave and pursue work or whatever. But it is interesting that while, at least again, multiple people heard the loud fall, there's no indication that this individual reported hearing the loud fall. There's a reason for that, which is the fact that even by the time Mrs. Vooz came to check on the rooms and discovered John Curtis dead, which again was around 7 a.m. April 12th, the guy that was in the room next to him was already gone. Didn't say anything to anybody, didn't check. I don't know if you would even have to check out. I mean, I don't know what the circumstances were, but this guy was gone. It's unknown exactly when he left. Could he have been responsible for the footsteps we heard going down the stairs? After the loud fall was heard that everyone assumes was John Curtis hitting the ground. Nobody knows for certain when this guy left. All we know is that he had checked into the room. I think it's even a presumption that he was even there the night before and the hours leading up to when John Curtis died. Nobody knows exactly when he was there or when exactly he left. But it is interesting that he split seemingly during the early morning hours, that he should have had a pretty clear view into John Curtis's room to see some of what happened. And again, it appears the guy never gave a name. I don't even know if they even bothered. Again, this is a privately run rooming house at the dawn of the 1890s. This is not a hotel now where, you have to put your credit card down. You got to provide proof of who you are. You got to do all this shit online to show that you're a living, breathing human being and all that stuff. But this is 1891. I'm sure a lot of people would just come in on the streets and just be like, hey, I need a room for a night. And they'd say, like, that'll be, whatever, it's a long time ago. I'd be like, okay, that'll be 30 cents or whatever. And he'd be like, all right, there's your money. And then they'll be like, all right, you're in room 4 upstairs. All right. And they go up to their room. It's probably about as simple as it was. So, and in the case of John Curtis, he'd been living there for a while, so they actually, knew him by name. But this guy seemed to just hit and run. So was that guy responsible? Was this person the killer of John Curtis? And because we don't know who he is, we don't know if he had a past with John Curtis, which might explain, did Curtis, if John Curtis was such a womanizer, did he have another woman in his past whose heart he broke, and the brother made it his mission to find him and snuff him out? This is just a wild speculation on my part, obviously. And he finally tracks him down at this rooming house, and he scores the room next to him, goes in, shoots him, runs away. Nobody has any idea who he is. I mean, that happened a lot. It was called honor killing. I've covered the unwritten law numerous times, and during this time, the unwritten law was absolutely in effect. And, the unwritten law, in short, was the notion that if somebody, pretty much anybody that tried to break up a family, or anybody that tried to misrepresent someone in your immediate family. Some guy comes along, sweeps your wife off her feet, and engages in an affair with her. Adultery. Someone disgraces your younger sister or younger brother. I mean, it was almost always instances of men killing in the honor of a woman, either a man killing with the honor of his wife. That guy came in and tried to break up my family unit, and nobody does that, not in this country. And there was a case in the early start of the 1900s of a guy named Lincoln Whitney, who tried to pretty much he was another one of these guys that was really obsessively trying to get this woman to be with him, and apparently he defiled her, as would be more kind of terminology of that time. And so the idea was that he'd kind of ruined her because he'd done that to her. It's that other time again. He'd ruined her. He'd defiled her out of wedlock, and now she was damaged goods. That was kind of the attitude, which is so tragic. But also, Lincoln Whitney showed up one day, and the brother, I can't remember the family's name. I think their last name was Murray, I want to say. I don't really remember. Or Monroe. And this brother shot Lincoln Whitney dead. And it was one of those things where it was absolutely he pulled a gun up and shot this guy dead. And then ran for it. And that was considered honor killing. And there's extensive examples that I've covered numerous times involving instances of men killing their wives' lovers and getting off for it. It was justifiable homicide. This scumbag tried to ingratiate himself into a woman's life who was a, happily married woman. That's one theory that was common at the time, defending the honor of a family member. John Curtis did seem to attract women based on the circumstances of the story. But the fact of the matter is, I can go this way, that way, 20 ways at once. The fact of the matter is we don't know who this guy was. We don't know if he was involved. We don't know what his motives might have been. But it is interesting that this guy bailed. Probably within at least an hour or two, if not at the most 4 or 5 hours after John Curtis is killed. So there's always room for speculation on that matter. Was that the guy that did it? And we'll never know. That's the hard part, is when you have certain people that you think make really strong suspects in a case, there can be, these other people possibly involved that you'd never heard of, wouldn't associate with the victim, people you can't even identify, who may very well have been the killer. There's so many mysterious, unsolved murders out there, and a lot of them were probably the work of some person that we don't know, whose identity we'll never know. So as we, circle the drain trying to come up with theories, the fact of the matter is a good chunk of these cases are never going to be solved because the person responsible is someone we don't know or someone we'd never even think of as a likely suspect. Traveling serial killers or, killers that will bounce from one spot to another. So-and-so could end up in one city Friday morning, leave Saturday afternoon. Someone turns up dead Friday night. That person traveling through town kills them, but nobody even knows that they were there. So you wouldn't even think of them as a suspect because you wouldn't even know if they were there or not. Of course, I'm talking cases in the past. Nowadays, it's pretty easy to track where people were. You've got so many different methods, but yeah, the murder case itself in the matter of John Curtis is not really wild, crazy, elaborate. There wasn't a bunch of pieces of evidence on the ground. It was just a guy that got shot in the head, fell over, and then the gun landed next to him. There wasn't any signs of a struggle. There wasn't any big, odd, intriguing other pieces of evidence. They didn't find a handkerchief on the ground that they can't figure out who owned it, that kind of stuff. It was just a very simple murder scene. But that's the thing, is that it was a murder scene. But the circumstances involving particularly his dynamic with, again, this woman we only know as Mrs. Ben West. And, again, this case ended up fading away pretty much after, not even a week. So whatever happened to Mrs. Ben West, I don't really know. I don't even know her first name. I was hoping when I figured out what Ben West's real name was and looked him up on, Find a Grave, that I'd be able to find her on there as a former spouse, but no luck. Jenny Gibbs, no idea what happened to her afterward. The people involved in this case, I don't really know anything about what happened to them afterwards. And again, it seems like these two women were never really seriously considered suspects. But again, John Curtis didn't really have any enemies. Nobody seemed to be out to get him. He wasn't rich, giving someone incentive to want to rob him. He was just a bartender living in a little rooming house who pretty much seldomly had money because he was always giving it away to this one woman he was with. But everyone who knew him said he was pretty easy to get along with, didn't seem to piss people off, drive some random person to the edge enough that they would kill him. I don't know. That's part of the intrigue. It's such a just interesting set of circumstances for a murder case that in and of itself is not that dramatic and was only in the newspapers for a couple of days. And yet it's captivating to me. There's so much to think about and to take away from this one event and this, mix of newspaper articles I found, which are literally the only thing you can really find. In fact, the most detailed article I found was posted. The text was posted in on the page on findagrave.com for John Curtis. They posted this long Oregonian article. that included the interviews with Jenny Gibbs and Mrs. Ben West, where a lot of the story that I've conveyed about them came from that one article. So it's just a story that's really captivated me, and after delving back into the information, I have a more clear but also like more drawn out, reflective perspective on it. But yeah, it just goes to show, you really dive in and, let a case settle and marinate in your brain, and then the details, you can just bring out more reflection.